So thank you very much, everybody, for having me. So I've been asked to come and talk to you a little bit about the INSPECTSR project. So we're developing a tool for detecting problematic trials in systematic reviews. So I'll tell you a bit about that over the next half hour. So my disclosures, no industry ties or anything like that. Currently hold or have recently held research grants from these places. And as Rachel mentioned, I have some stats editor roles a few different places, including Cochrane Gynecology and Fertility. I'll disclose that, but don't think there's any real big conflicts of interest here. So before we go any further, just a quick disclaimer. So in this talk, I'm not accusing anybody of fraud. I'm not accusing anybody of data fabrication or falsification or any kind of research misconduct, all right? So I am going to say that some trials are perhaps unlikely to be authentic, okay? Or perhaps that they are untrustworthy. And by that, I just mean the data or the results just don't appear to be compatible with a genuine trial, okay? But I'm not claiming that this is due to any deliberate action on behalf of the authors of those papers. There could be other explanations, okay? So serious errors in the delivery of the study or the reporting of the study, for example. So we've got two parts to the talk today. So first of all, I'm going to give you some background and tell you a little bit about the INSPECTSR project. And then in a second part, I'm going to describe some principles that we use for investigating potentially problematic RCTs. So let's start here. Bit of background and a bit of an introduction to the INSPECTSR project. And let's start with this motivating example. So you may be familiar with this one. So ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19. So a couple of systematic reviews were done looking at trials of ivermectin for COVID-19. And as you can see from the results over on the right, both of these reviews suggested quite impressive benefits of ivermectin for reducing death, okay? So if you look at the relative risks on the right and those confidence intervals there, they're both suggesting quite substantial benefits. And perhaps, unsurprisingly, this received a lot of attention, okay? So these reviews were widely covered in the media, on Twitter, etc. All right. Of course they were, okay? We have this wonderful treatment for COVID. And it was actually, they were actually used by anti-vax groups. So those groups were able to say, look, we've got this wonderful treatment for COVID-19. We don't even need vaccination, okay? We can use ivermectin instead. But it turns out there was a bit of a problem, okay? And the problem is that it now looks like several of the trials included in those systematic reviews were not authentic, all right? So what I'm showing you here, apologies for the blurry image, but this is a spreadsheet containing data purportedly from one of those trials. And this is some analysis by Nick Brown. And what Nick's done here is he's color-coded blocks of data, which are just repeated in the spreadsheet, okay? So this is clearly not genuine RCT data, okay? For whatever reason, this is not authentic. We have duplication in the spreadsheet. So what happened if we do some meta-analysis restricted to trials which are, in some sense, more credible, all right? So the second systematic review I showed you on the previous slide from Hill and colleagues, they retracted their review, okay? That's good, that's the right thing to do, I think. And they said the significant effect of ivermectin on survival was dependent on the inclusion of studies with a high risk of bias or potential medical fraud, okay? And when they removed those studies, you can see the confidence interval there, it's complete uncertainty, right? We have no idea if ivermectin helps, harms, or does nothing at all. Another review, which I haven't shown you so far, the Cochrane review, was much more discerning in the trials they included, okay? And they stratified by disease severity. And in both those cases there, you can see there's just so much uncertainty. We have no idea. We're certainly not seeing this clear evidence of a benefit, okay? And then the other systematic review I showed you a couple of slides ago, that one currently has an expression of concern from the journal due to these issues. So is this surprising, okay? Is this incident surprising? And I'm not sure that it is. In fact, I think it's probably inevitable that something like this will happen, right? But let's think about what happens when we do a systematic review. So first of all, we attempt to identify all of the trials that have been done on our topic. That means that these problematic trials, if they exist, are very likely to be picked up and included. We try to be inclusive. What do we do next? Well, we critically appraise the methodology of those studies, right? And we typically do that by, assessing risk of bias, for example. But those assessments are basically predicated on the assumption that the trials were genuine, that they took place as described. And we don't usually question the authenticity of the studies. And unfortunately, many of these fake trials report perfectly good methods, so they're not flagged by risk of bias assessments. And then, of course, we'll meta-analyze the trials, we'll make some conclusions and recommendations on the basis of that. And of course, systematic reviews are very influential, right? They're seen as a gold standard, they're included in guidelines, and they have a real influence on patient care, all right? So we can kind of see how systematic reviews might be acting as like a pipeline for this fake data to influence patient care, which is a real concern. And this isn't, isolated to one particular clinical area or anything like that. So I've put a few different examples from different clinical areas on the screen here. So vitamin K for prevention of fractures, tranexamic acid for postpartum hemorrhage, a recent Cochrane review, psychological therapies for the management of chronic pain. These are all examples where it looks like some of the eligible studies were probably not authentic, okay? So recognizing that this is a problem, we now have a Cochrane policy about this, don't we? So we have the policy on managing potentially problematic studies, which is good. And what that policy says is, that we should not include studies in our systematic review until serious concerns about trustworthiness have been resolved, okay? But that prompts some further questions, right? So how do we define a problematic study? And how do we detect these studies, all right? And those are the questions that we've been funded to answer in the INSPECTSR project, okay? So we've received some funding from the NIHR to undertake this project, which aims to develop a tool for identifying problematic RCTs in health systematic reviews. So how are we doing that? So we have convened a panel of people, of experts, basically, right? So people with expertise and experience in investigating problematic studies. We then created an extensive list of different methods that we might use for detecting problematic studies. And we're currently in the process of, applying this long list to a large sample of systematic reviews, all right? And we're also going to take that long list and enter all of the items into a Delphi process. So the idea there is that we're going to have these two strands of evidence. We're going to find out some stuff about feasibility and impact of all of these items from our application to systematic reviews. We're going to see which items are supported by expert consensus as well. And we can use those two strands of evidence to sort of select which items are going to be included in this tool, if you like, all right? And maybe what this tool will look like. And then our plan is to spend a year testing this tool, or testing our draft tool, I suppose, right? So testing it in the production and update of new systematic reviews, we'll get some feedback and use that to improve the draft, okay? So we're partway through this process now, and I'll tell you a bit about some of the steps we've done so far. So first of all, how did we create this list of methods to consider? Well, we took items from a few different places. So there was a recent scoping review looking at methods to assess research misconduct, a recent qualitative study of experts, which identified some more suggestions. And then we just added some other methods known to us, okay? So my background is in conducting integrity investigations for journals and publishers. So there are methods that I use known to me that I added to the list as well, for example. So we had an initial list of like 102 checks or tests, and we just implemented that online as a survey, showed that to experts, people with experience in this area, and we just quite simply asked, are we missing anything? can you make any suggestions? Any comments on the items on the list we have already? So just to give you some ideas about the kinds of items we have to play with, to work with, what I'm showing you here is sort of like preliminary sort of classifications for the items. So we've classified them into 5 domains and 1 example from each domain, okay? So let's just quickly go through these examples. So in our first domain, we have inspecting the results in the paper. And an example of an item there is, are the results substantially divergent from others in the meta-analysis? And straight away, that's the kind of check or consideration that might make some of us quite nervous, right? If we're going to start excluding trials on the basis of their results, you could see how that could potentially introduce some bias into our meta-analysis. But let me just show you a motivating example, I guess, right? So this is a recent Cochrane review, psychological therapies for chronic pain. If you kind of just take a second to have a look at the forest plot here, you can see that there are these 3 estimates, all from the same author, okay? And they're clearly highly discrepant from the rest of the studies, okay? And this prompted the authors to look into these studies a little bit more, and this highlighted some causes for concern about the integrity of those studies, all right? So I think it's worth leaving that one on the table for now. Just returning to our list. So our second domain is inspecting conduct, governance, and transparency. So an example, is the recruitment of participants plausible? Inspecting the research team, have other studies by the research team been retracted? Do they have expressions of concern? Inspecting the text and publication details, any evidence of copied work, duplicated tables. And then if we can access it, we have lots of checks for inspecting IPD, expecting the individual participant data. So an example would be, does the data set contain repeated sequences of baseline values? So what did we find when we put that list online and asked people to comment on it? I mean, we got a really good response, actually. I think we'd aimed for a minimum of 50 responses, and we ended up with 71 is a real number of participants. So we got people from 5 continents. That sounds good, but it was actually mostly Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and North America. So there probably is considerable room for sort of improvements in reaching different parts of the globe in subsequent stages, I think. But it was a very useful exercise, right? So we got 25 pages of comments on our list, 16 new checks were proposed, and lots of suggestions to make modifications to existing items, okay? So merging existing items, splitting them, or just rewording them for clarity. And as a result, after carrying out that exercise, we ended up with 117 checks to consider, to take forward across our 5 domains. So quite a lot to consider. And now we're currently in the process of this stage here. So we're applying the list to a sample of systematic reviews. So briefly, so this is like a really big exercise, right? This is a really sort of big exercise. It's a long list, and we're applying them to lots of trials. So we've adopted a many hands make light work approach here. We've got a big collaboration with around 50 people involved, 50 researchers collaborating on this one. And everybody is taking the long list of checks, or that is the checks in the first 4 domains, okay? The 5th domain, as I mentioned, requires access to the individual participant data, which we're not going to have for this exercise. So we're looking at the checks in the first 4 domains. We'll talk a bit more about that in the second part of the talk. But everyone's applying the long list of checks. Basically, people are taking a Cochrane review each, and they're applying the long list of checks to the trials in the Cochrane review. And we're trying to find out various things here. So how often is each check failed? How often does it flag problems? How feasible do people find the checks? We give people the option to sort of rate a check as not being feasible. So how feasible do people find the checks to perform? And then we can look at, what is the impact of removing trials flagged by all of the checks? What impact does that have on meta-analysis? on the number of participants removed, etc. So this is a big ongoing project. We certainly need input and collaboration on this. People with all kinds of backgrounds, really. So methodologists, trialists, reviewers, editors, publishers, patients, RI professionals, researchers with experience of the topic. So what are some ways to be involved, I guess? I mean, I'm very aware that a credible tool is going to need to be feasible, all right? So we need to spend a lot of time assessing the feasibility, but it also needs to be sort of backed by very broad consensus, I think, to be credible. So some chances to be involved or to try things out. So at the Cochrane Colloquium in September, there's going to be an INSPECTSR workshop. So that'll be a chance to come and try a very early draft version of the tool, largely based on the results of this application exercise that I just described. A chance to introduce you to the idea, introduce you to a draft version, and for you to give us some feedback and your ideas. All right. So please do join us if you're available and at the colloquium. That's going to be the Wednesday lunchtime, I believe. We need people to participate in an upcoming Delphi. So we're going to be doing quite a large Delphi on this. That includes people with expertise around the methods, but also potential users of the tool as well. So we're gathering opinions from those two main groups, if you like. And then we're going to need people who would be willing to test the draft version of the tool while undertaking, a systematic review or updating a systematic review. And then we'd ask you for some feedback about your experience in doing that as well. Okay. And just to be clear, that long list of checks we have, we are whittling that down. Okay. The final tool will contain a subset of those. All right. A lot of people kind of look in horror. They sort of misinterpret me as sort of saying, we're going to ask people to go away and apply 71 checks to every trial. All right. The point is that lots of these checks may not be feasible or may not be useful or may be redundant given other checks. All right. And that's why we're doing this research, to work out what should be in the tool. But basically, if you have any expertise, experience, or really just any interest in testing example, then please just contact me and I'll show you my contact details again at the end of this talk. So this is a big project. Okay. I imagine we're probably still, 18 months off before having a final tool to recommend. There are lots of things that are available right now. Okay, so I've put on the screen here a variety of different proposals, checklists for assessing research integrity that are available right now. And I'll just tell you about a few other bits of work that are ongoing that I'm aware of. So colleagues at the University of Sydney have been doing some work on assessing data integrity in the context of IPD meta-analysis. So that's an interesting situation where you have the underlying data sets from all of the trials that you're considering. That opens up a lot of possibilities, I think. So I understand that that's ongoing at the moment. I'll also mention some work that I'm aware of by Colby Vorland, which is quite interesting. So I think Colby's developing some software that would automate some of these checks. Okay, so for example, it can take a baseline table from a published paper and do some things like try to reproduce some of the statistical analyses to make sure they're correct, and try to identify some other potential errors in there as well. So that'll be very useful when that comes to fruition. Okay, so that was the first part of the talk. I'm just going to stop to take a few questions there, if anyone would like to ask any.
Thanks, Jack. We've had some questions in the chat box.
Okay.
So first of all, from Ella, thanks, Jack. Interesting developments. At what part of the review process would you expect authors to complete these checks? And would the checks all happen at one stage, or would you expect different checks to be embedded at different stages? For example, some at data extraction and some at interpretation of the syntheses.
So to be clear, all to be decided, right? Everything is on the table. So not just the checks that are going to be included, but the actual process of, implementing it, what it's going to look like. What is the flow going to be? Will it be that we're recommending that people perform, a few higher level checks, and then to go into a bit more detail if those checks have failed, for example. Too early to sort of commit to that yet. But this is, part of what we're working out by having lots of people try it, getting lots of feedback, getting lots of input. Again, we need to really think hard about the feasibility of doing this in the process of conducting a real systematic review. So I don't have those answers yet, but it's certainly part of what we're trying to work out.
Brilliant, thanks, Jack. And another question from Ella. Do you have plans to assess feasibility from an author's perspective and feasibility from an editor's perspective?
Yeah.
For example, what kind of editorial checks might need to be made for reviews that use this tool?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that we're going to try to have a year of prospective testing, basically. And there we're going to try to involve authors, but also, as you say, editors as well. Okay. So what is the experience of using this, or, of having authors use this from an editorial perspective? So the idea is that we're going to be trying to survey both of those sort of groups, I guess, the authors and the editors, in this prospective testing phase. And then ultimately the idea is to hold some sort of large workshop, including people who've been involved in all that testing, bring everyone together, have discussions about the experience, what can we do to sort of streamline this, improve it, etc.
Thanks, Jack. Okay, and a question from Nipon, I hope I pronounced that right. Do you have plans to extend this project to add checks for identifying fraudulent RCTs in IPD meta-analysis?
So I mentioned some work that's ongoing. Colleagues at Sydney who are looking at methods in the context of IPD meta-analysis. We'll certainly be extending this to look at the situation where you are able to get IPD for trials. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the second half of the talk.
Great, thank you. And a question from Emma, really interesting talk. Do you think this tool will become mandatory for Cochrane authors when it's finalised, like risk of bias is mandatory?
Oh, I don't know. We should probably see if it's any good first, right? Let's see if we do a good job, I guess, if people like it before we go there. So
yeah. And I think final question for this part from Miranda. Fascinating project. What topic areas are the Cochrane reviews that you're doing the testing on?
Well, as many as we can. So as many as we can. We'd like to get as much coverage as we can. So in this testing that we're doing now, basically what we've said to people is we're trying to match people up to topics with which they have some familiarity, since that will probably match the use case, right? People tend to do systematic reviews on topics with which they do have some familiarity. And some of these checks might be more feasible if you do have some familiarity with the topic, right? So if we're talking about plausibility, feasibility, that's going to be much harder to assess if you don't have some familiarity with the topic. However, we're also very much aware that sometimes systematic reviews are done by people with limited topic expertise, okay? And so basically we have people in that situation as well as part of this assessment. And we're asking people to give their assessment of their own familiarity with the topic. And then we can try to have a look at, does feasibility of some of these checks really change according to people's self-assessed familiarity with the topic?